The men on the Bar W Ranch had a name for her long before they ever bothered to learn her first name properly, and that name was simply Cook. Emma Doyle had arrived at the ranch 3 years earlier with nothing but a battered trunk and a letter of reference from a hotel in Cheyenne, and from that first day, the cowhands treated her the way most outfits treated their kitchen help, with a kind of careless, unthinking dismissal that assumed a woman standing over a stove couldn't possibly matter as much as a man on a horse. She cooked their meals 3 times a day, mended their shirts when asked, and kept the bunkhouse stocked with enough biscuits and coffee to fuel a dozen hard-working men, and in return she received little more than grunted thanks and the occasional complaint about over-salted stew. She had grown used to being invisible in the particular way that only hard-working women in a man's world understood, present everywhere and valued nowhere, essential and overlooked in the same breath. The ranch belonged to old man Wallace Hutton, a stern but fair rancher who had built the Bar W from nothing after the war, and his foreman, a broad-shouldered cowboy named Jake Colton, ran the daily operations with an iron discipline that left little room for softness. Jake was the kind of man who measured worth in calluses and grit, who judged people by what they could rope, brand, or break, and by that measure, Emma Doyle simply didn't register as anyone of consequence. He was polite enough to her, in the distracted way a man is polite to furniture he walks past every day, but he never once thought to ask her opinion on anything beyond what was for supper. Emma didn't mind the quiet dismissal as much as folks might expect, mostly because she had come to the Bar W carrying grief of her own, having lost her husband to a mining accident 2 years before she ever set foot in Wyoming, and cooking for 30 hungry cowhands left little time for dwelling on sorrow. She found a strange comfort in the rhythm of the kitchen, the pre-dawn hours spent kneading dough while the world outside was still dark and silent, the satisfaction of watching tired, hungry men eat their fill after a long day in the saddle. She told herself that being useful was enough, that she didn't need recognition to justify her place in the world, and for a long while, she almost believed it. That spring, the Bar W was hit with a run of misfortune that seemed to test every soul on the property. A wet winter had left the low pastures flooded well into April, delaying the calving season and leaving the herds thin and vulnerable. Then, just as the weather finally broke, a strange sickness swept through the bunkhouse, a fever that laid low nearly a third of the working hands within the span of a single week. Jake Colton found himself short-staffed at the worst possible time, with branding season looming and a herd that needed moving to summer pasture before the mountain passes closed for good. It was during this crisis that Emma first revealed herself to be something far more than the ranch cook everyone assumed her to be. When young Tommy Briggs collapsed in the yard with fever, shaking and delirious, it was Emma who recognized the sickness for what it truly was, having nursed her own mother through a similar outbreak back in Missouri years before. While the ranch hands stood around helplessly, uncertain what to do, Emma took charge with a calm authority that surprised everyone watching, directing them to isolate the sick men in the old bunkhouse, boiling water for compresses, mixing willow bark tea for the fevers, and organizing a rotation of care that kept the illness from spreading further than it already had. "You sure about all this, ma'am?" Jake had asked her that first night, watching her move between cots with a competence that unsettled his assumptions. "I buried my mother because nobody knew what to do when she got sick," Emma replied, not looking up from the compress she was wringing out. "I don't intend to bury anyone else for the same reason. Now either help me lift him up so I can change these linens, or step aside and let me work." Jake stepped aside, and over the following days, he found himself doing so more and more often, watching with growing respect as Emma Doyle managed the sick men with a steady hand and an even steadier will. She barely slept that week, moving between the kitchen and the makeshift infirmary, somehow still managing to feed the healthy hands while nursing the sick ones back toward health. By the time the fever finally broke, every man who had fallen ill had survived, a fact that seemed almost miraculous given how quickly such sicknesses could turn deadly on an isolated ranch far from any proper doctor. But the crisis had only begun to reveal Emma's true character, because no sooner had the sickness passed than the ranch faced a fresh disaster. The spring flooding that had delayed calving had also weakened the banks along Cutter's Creek, and a sudden late storm sent the creek raging over its banks in the middle of the night, threatening to sweep away not just the newly born calves pastured near the water but the small cabin where several ranch families lived with their children. Jake and the healthy hands were 3 days out moving the main herd to Summer Range, leaving only a skeleton crew back at the home ranch, most of them still weak from their recent illness. Emma was the one who heard the roar of the rising water first, waking in the deep hours of night to a sound that some deep instinct told her meant danger. She roused what few able-bodied men remained, and together they worked through the darkness and driving rain to move the panicked calves to higher ground, wading into water that grew more treacherous by the minute. When one of the recovering hands, still weak from fever, stumbled and went under in the rushing current, it was Emma who dove in after him without a moment's hesitation, pulling him to safety through water that could have easily swept them both away. By the time Jake and the main crew returned 3 days later, exhausted from the trail drive, they found a ranch that had weathered 2 separate disasters largely intact, thanks entirely to the leadership and courage of the woman they had always dismissed as simply the cook. The families in the cabin were safe, the surviving calves accounted for, the sick men on the mend, and all of it had happened because Emma Doyle refused to stand by and watch when action was needed. Jake heard the full story from Old Man Hutton himself, who had returned from a business trip to Cheyenne just in time to witness the aftermath, and something shifted in the foreman's understanding of the world as he listened to the account of Emma's actions. He found her later that evening in the kitchen, exhausted but still working, preparing supper for men who had no idea how close they had come to losing everything while they were away on the trail. "I heard what you did," Jake said, standing awkwardly in the kitchen doorway, hat in his hands. "With the sickness and then the flood. Heard you pulled Charlie Briggs right out of the current when he went under." "Someone had to," Emma replied simply, not pausing in her work. "Can't very well let a man drown because I'm too busy minding a stew pot." "That's not the point," Jake said, frustration and something like shame coloring his voice. "The point is, we've had you cooking our meals for 3 years, and not one of us ever thought to ask what else you might be capable of. We've been calling you just the cook, like that's all there was to you, when the truth is you probably know more about doctoring and disaster than half the men on this ranch put together." Emma finally looked up from her work, studying Jake's face with an expression that held more surprise than anything else. "I didn't do it for recognition, Mr. Colton. I did it because it needed doing." "I know that," Jake said. "That's exactly why it matters that we recognize it anyway." The following morning, Jake called all the hands together in the yard before they scattered to their duties, and in front of every man on the Bar W, he made a point of setting the record straight. "I want every one of you to understand something," he said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won respect. "While we were out driving cattle these past days, this ranch faced 2 disasters that could have ended in tragedy. Sickness that could have killed half our crew, and a flood that could have swept away the families living in the creek cabin. We came home to find everyone safe, every calf accounted for, because of one person who didn't wait for someone else to take charge." He paused, looking directly at Emma, who stood near the kitchen doorway with flour still dusting her apron. "This woman, who we've all been calling just the cook for 3 years, saved every single one of us. She nursed the sick back to health with her own hands, and she pulled a drowning man out of a flooding creek without a second thought for her own safety. I don't ever want to hear anyone on this ranch refer to Mrs. Doyle as just anything again. She's the reason half of you are standing here today." The yard fell silent, 30 hardened cowhands absorbing words that reshaped everything they thought they understood about the woman who fed them 3 times a day. Old Man Hutton, standing off to the side, nodded his agreement, and one by one, the men began to approach Emma, offering their thanks with a sincerity that had been entirely absent in their previous interactions with her. Young Tommy Briggs, still weak but recovering, hugged her fiercely, tears in his eyes as he thanked her for saving his life. Charlie, the man she had pulled from the flood, could barely speak through his emotion as he tried to express gratitude for a debt he knew he could never fully repay. Emma stood amid this unexpected outpouring, uncertain how to respond to recognition she had never sought and hadn't believed she needed. For 3 years she had told herself that being useful was enough, that she didn't require anyone's acknowledgement to justify her worth. But standing there in the yard, surrounded by men who finally saw her, she realized how deeply she had craved this moment without ever admitting it to herself, how much it had cost her to be constantly present yet perpetually unseen. In the weeks that followed, everything about Emma's position on the ranch shifted. Jake began consulting her not just about meals but about broader decisions affecting the ranch families, recognizing a wisdom and competence in her that extended far beyond the kitchen. He asked her opinion on how best to handle the isolation cabin for future illness outbreaks, on what supplies the ranch should keep on hand for emergencies, on how to better organize the families living on the property to ensure everyone's safety during the unpredictable Wyoming seasons. What had begun as grudging respect slowly deepened into something Jake hadn't expected, a genuine admiration for a woman whose strength and capability matched, and in some ways exceeded, his own. Their conversations, once limited to brief exchanges about supper preferences, grew longer and more meaningful, often extending late into the evening after the other hands had retired for the night. Jake found himself seeking out Emma's company not from necessity but from genuine desire, drawn to a woman who had weathered her own grief and hardship yet somehow retained a fierce, practical compassion for everyone around her. Emma, for her part, found herself looking forward to these conversations more than she cared to admit, discovering in Jake a depth of character she hadn't previously credited him with, a man capable of admitting his own blindness and working to correct it. Summer deepened into autumn, and the Bar W Ranch settled into a new rhythm, one where Emma Doyle's contributions were finally recognized and valued as they always should have been. She continued to cook, because she took genuine pride in the work and found satisfaction in nourishing the people around her. But now she did so alongside a growing role in the ranch's broader operations, her advice sought after and respected rather than assumed irrelevant. The families on the property had taken to calling her by her given name rather than simply Cook, a small shift that meant more to Emma than she had words to express. It was on a crisp October evening, with the aspens turning gold across the hillsides and the first hints of winter chill in the air, that Jake finally found the courage to say what had been building in his heart for months. He found Emma sitting on the porch after supper had been cleared away, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of amber and rose, and he sat down beside her without quite knowing how to begin. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, turning his hat over in his hands the way he did when nervous, "about how wrong I was about you, right from the start. 3 years I had you cooking my meals and never once bothered to see the whole of who you were. Took a crisis to open my eyes to what should have been obvious all along." "You see clearly enough now," Emma said, a gentle smile touching her lips. "That's more than most men manage in a lifetime." "I don't want to just see you clearly," Jake said, and something in his tone made Emma turn to look at him fully. "I want to build something with you, Emma. Not because you saved this ranch, though God knows you did, but because these past months talking with you, working alongside you, I've come to care for you in a way I never expected. You're the strongest, most capable person I've ever known, man or woman, and I'd be a fool not to tell you plainly that I've fallen in love with you." Emma's breath caught, old grief and new hope colliding in her chest in a way that left her momentarily speechless. She had come to the Bar W believing her capacity for love had been buried alongside her husband, content to find meaning in quiet usefulness rather than risk the vulnerability of caring for someone again. But sitting beside Jake Colton on that porch, watching the last light fade behind the mountains, she recognized in herself an answering warmth she could no longer deny. "I never expected to feel this way again," she admitted softly. "I thought that part of my life had ended when I buried my husband. But these past months, watching you change, watching this whole ranch change in how they see me, in how they see what a person can be capable of when given the chance, I've found myself hoping for things I'd long since given up on." "Then don't give up on them," Jake said, reaching for her hand with the same gentle care he might use with a spooked horse, patient and steady. "Let me be part of whatever comes next for you, Emma. Let this ranch and this life be something we build together instead of something you simply survive while the rest of us fail to notice your worth." Emma laced her fingers with his, feeling the roughness of a working man's hands against her own equally weathered palm, and something settled inside her that had been unsettled since the day she'd lost her husband. "I think," she said, "that I would like that very much." They married the following spring, in a simple ceremony held right there in the yard where Jake had once called every hand together to set the record straight about Emma's worth. The entire ranch turned out for the celebration, families and cowhands alike, all of them eager to witness the union of two people who had found in each other a partnership built on hard-won respect rather than empty assumption. Old Man Hutton gave Emma away himself, having come to regard her as something like a daughter over the years of her service, and the celebration that followed lasted well into the night, filled with music and laughter and a joy that felt earned rather than simply given. Emma never stopped cooking for the ranch hands, because the work brought her genuine satisfaction and connected her to a community she had come to love, but she was never again simply the cook. She became, in time, the beating heart of the Bar W Ranch, her wisdom sought in every major decision, her strength relied upon in every crisis, her compassion extended to every family that called the ranch home. She and Jake built a life together marked by mutual respect and deep partnership, raising a family of their own while continuing to steward the community that had once overlooked her and now couldn't imagine functioning without her. Years later, when new hands arrived at the bar W and made the same mistakes so many had made before, dismissing the older woman in the kitchen as merely hired help, it was always Jake who set them straight, telling the story of the fever and the flood, of a woman who had saved lives while everyone else stood paralyzed by uncertainty. "That's Emma Colton," he would say, pride evident in every word. "Don't let the apron fool you. She's the strongest person on this ranch, and if you're smart, you'll listen when she speaks, because she's earned the right to be heard by every one of us, twice over." And the new hands, hearing the conviction in their foreman's voice, would look at Emma with new eyes, understanding before they even had the chance to make the same mistake that this woman deserved not just their respect, but their genuine admiration, for she had proven, in the truest sense, that the measure of a person's worth had nothing to do with the work they did and everything to do with the strength of their character when it mattered most.